It's extremely difficult at times to find meaning in our suffering. In fact, a lot of times where people go naturally is wondering if there's even a point. And that's not just about suffering, that's about everything. So let's develop that a little bit, see where it goes, see what the implications are, and then see where Judaism can come in and potentially offer some light in terms of the viewpoint that we have that we can adopt. So we live in a world that it oftentimes is beset by an approach of, an opinion of, a possibility of randomness. We see that there are a multitude of ways of looking at the world. We see that there are a multiple ways of understanding the world. The more and the older that we get, the more diversified social media becomes and media in general becomes, the more we appreciate that if you have a worldview, so you could literally set up an algorithm around which your entire world will resonate. And that's, on one hand, now it's almost like you don't know what's happening, but practically speaking, you know what's happening, right? It's like when you go and you didn't even think about something, but next thing you know, like that opportunity to buy that thing is like being sold to you on Instagram. You're like, somebody's watching, somebody has some idea. So ultimately, what does this mean in the macro? In the macro, it means that you could essentially assign any value you want to anything at any time. And there are people that seem to say, well, that's right, and an entire worldview. So ultimately, if you think one step beyond that, what you realize is that it's entirely possible for you to think, to view, to experience, to appreciate anything you want. You can have any experience that you want. And the problem with that is it touches on and it starts to push us away from the sense of permanence. And it means that, like, well, anything's possible. And, this was one option, but I could have taken another 100 options, 1,000 options, infinite number of options. And if there's an infinite number of options, really the path that you choose in a lot of ways seems to be irrelevant. And that's difficult because when a person starts to think that anything is possible and that everything is irrelevant, eventually their life, their suffering, their challenges, the choices they make, all of that stuff starts to be like, well, that's the choice that I took, but really a million different worlds could have been opened up. And that starts to sit with us because in a lot of ways, our experience of reality, in a lot of ways, our experience of right and wrong and all of the ways that we perceive existence is one thing. But then when we touch things that are real, it starts to throw us in a different direction. So let me develop that a little bit. What does it mean real? So ultimately, suffering comes and tragedy comes and pain comes, and that does not seem like relative at all, right? We perceive difficulty in real time. And, it's like you stub your toe or you lose your job or you have a traumatic experience or any of these things, you're like, that could actually really hurt. And as you're going through challenges, heartbreak, the loss of innocence, the loss of expectation, when somebody lets you down, when somebody dies, all of these kinds of things, those things bring us back in a lot of ways to being real. It's very funny to consider this because, again, outside of a Jewish context, this is not a new problem. In fact, and it's also not a uniquely religious problem. One of the leading thinkers in the world today is a psychologist whose name is Jordan Peterson. And one of the things that he said he was able to find out was like actually real was the existence of suffering. When he didn't know anything else, but then he started to realize that there was such a thing called evil because he was studying the crimes of history, the crimes of the Holocaust, the crimes that was committed by the Soviet Union in the gulags, right? And he started to say, this is so fundamentally wrong. This is so fundamentally evil. It's like, if this is just relative evil, it's like, it's like the entire world comes upside down. So it's absolutely a fascinating concept there because you see that even from a non-Jewish perspective, from a psychological, from a medical perspective, you see that there are certain things in the realm of evil that all of a sudden you're like, yes, that's for sure bad. So again, you could think to yourself on a certain level, me stubbing my toe is like, okay, that happens. But on the flip side, what you could say is you look at something like the horrors of Saddam Hussein, the horrors of the Nazi regime, the horrors of all of these kinds of components, and you say, that's pretty bad. And if you can't say that's bad, and again, this was a conversation that I used to have with people when I was, even now, but especially when when I was working at UCLA, and you had a population that was far more of the mindset that it was kind of all relative. So I would say, and again, we talked about, horrible things, and it's like, is that bad? And eventually most people would say, okay, that's bad. It's interesting because from a Jewish perspective, we've almost become so inoculated of the Holocaust that we would say, well, is Hitler bad? And say, well, Hitler was just raised a certain way. So then you start to paint another tragedy, another horrific occurrence in world history, and oftentimes when you remove it from your own thing that you've grown up and you're necessarily aware of and used to, so to speak, and you start talking about the torture rooms of Saddam Hussein or the horrors of child trafficking, all these kinds of things. Suddenly you can say like, okay, people say, yeah, that's bad. So it's fascinating because for a lot of us, we live in a world that's all relative in a lot of ways, but then we start to bump up against things like tragedy, like pain, like, again, if you take it to an extreme example and you start to look on the big picture of like what's actually like awful, right? Those kinds of things, you start to say, okay, well, that's actually bad. You say, do I know that for sure? You say, pretty much, yeah. I have a really hard time saying not. And if that's not bad, but just like my perception, so suddenly your entire world kind of comes off its axis. So Jordan Peterson said, I can know that evil is bad. And then once he started to appreciate that evil is bad, he started to realize that not doing that is the definition of good, is the definition of meaning, and all these kinds of concepts. So oftentimes, again, to go back to the initial perspective, right, we live in a world where it's relatively simple because of how we've grown up to think that it's all kind of random. And then that leads us down a road of my life is kind of random, the decisions I make are kind of random, the path that I could take is random. And on the flip side, what we can think about is that really true? And even if you walk outside of a religious context and you think about the randomness of, so to speak, of good and evil, suddenly you start to see, no, bad for me seems to kind of stab through my moral ambiguity and start to touch me really. It's like, it's all random, and then you lose your job. And it's like, that's random. And you're like, no, that's terrible. I can't survive with that. Or, you get broken up with, or your spouse is unfaithful, or whatever it is. That cuts you in such a deep way that you start to appreciate that, you know what? All of the relativity of the world, when it comes down to like my finger getting like, stuck by a pin, that becomes very real. So it's fascinating how we think about that. So now let's potentially bring it to a Jewish perspective. What does this actually mean? So from a Jewish perspective, again, working with the basic fundamentals of Jewish philosophy, there's a concept that there's God. God, again, is a word that does not encapsulate the actual idea. We call it, again, the word God is so fraught and wrought and delivers such deep, in a lot of ways, negative, deeply painful concepts for so many people, they don't want to use it. So you'll find people that'll say, I'm a highly enlightened person. I'm going to call it the universe or the Almighty or the All-Powerful. Again, and that's not a Jewish problem. From a Jewish perspective, it's like, well, from a very fundamental, if you look at the most fundamental of Jewish texts, that's where we take off. We say, look, from a Jewish perspective, we have no ability how to name God. God is the infinite, right? And we are finite. So at best, all we can do is like kind of assign a placemaker so we sort of know what we're talking about a little bit, but we don't know what we're talking about at all because this concept is beyond us. In one of the deep Jewish philosophical sources explains how the creation, the piece of pottery can't understand the mind of the potter. Right? But we still have to know that a potter exists. So from a Jewish perspective, we know there is an infinite first cause. And the first cause, again, and we're not going to go into right now the debate of how do we know, which is totally possible, and you can totally know, but it could be a discussion, not for now, right? But the practical implication of a first cause, which is infinite, which is that everything that happens in the world is not random. Because one element of randomness in a perfect system implies the entire system's not perfect. And on the flip side, if there is actual randomness in this system, right, so then there is no control whatsoever. So it's a very deep idea because these are concepts that are on or off. It's binary. It's binary. It's one or the other, right? So in a world where there is absolute control, That's called a world of godliness, right? That's called the world of the infinite that has ultimate control over everything. And this is a very deep idea. Again, I'm going to explain, we're going to go slowly what the implications of this are, which means that even and again, I'm specifically not quoting sources, not because I don't know the sources, not because these sources are not important, because traditionally in Jewish education, you're always quoting the sources in order to know the validity of what we're talking about. But on the flip side, to a modern audience, I found that until you know the sources and you're like, oh yeah, that's cool, it's like, just tell me the concepts and let's see if I can integrate that into my worldview. But if you have an infinite God, and an infinite God is in control all the time. Why is the infinite God in control all the time? Because the idea of randomness is opposite of complete control, right? And complete control is what the infinite has. If I, and again, just slowly, we'll just go through this, right? If a tree could, a leaf could fall outside, right? And it could be outside of my Jacob Rupp's control. Why? Because my sphere of influence ends here, and that's totally fine. Because as a finite being, there are things outside of my control. But God is not finite. He's infinite. He's the first cause. He's beyond time and space, right? And so it's incapable. It's impossible that anything would happen outside of his direct control. Why? Right? Why? Because if things did, unless he would be finite, right? He would have limitations. Makes sense, I hope. So the idea is you live in a world of God. In a world of God, there is absolute control, and everything happens for a reason, right? What's the reason? Now, again, as finite people, we don't necessarily have purview of that, right? Why? Again, why does the economy do what it does? Why does infectious disease go according to a certain path? The foundations is that a person, a normal person, a logical, a person that's plugged into the world, hopefully now in the time that this is being recorded, appreciates that there are things that happen outside of their control, but with the right study and with the right understanding and with the right technology and tools, we can understand why that happens. If you don't know why the economy functions the way it does, there are people who do study these things, who do understand how it works, who are able to say this isn't just a random happenstance, but there are causes that cause all of these things. It does not change the outcome, by the way, knowing what happens, but we understand why they do happen. Oftentimes, the event allows us to look into the cause. It allows us to apply what happened based on our understanding of all kinds of things, and as a result, derive a theory, derive opinions about why they happen, if that makes sense. Which means going further, it's like, the economy hits a recession. Now, let's say you don't know anything about the government, that you don't know anything about the economy. You've been living under a rock. You have no appreciation for worldly events. So you could say that was random, and the answer is like, no, it wasn't. Even if you don't understand it, the statement of saying if you're looking at the world and you're looking at a system of cause and effect, just because you don't know why it happens does not imply that it didn't happen for a reason. It also does not imply that the reason why it happened is unknowable. It just means that you don't know it right now, which is crucial. Why? Because if it's relevant to your life, if it's valuable for you, if it's important to you, the first step is not to say, it could have gone that way, it could have gone a different way. It's like, no. Once you see something that actually matters and you don't understand why it happens, you have to apply a different approach, which is, if I would put effort and understanding and appreciation into it, I could potentially figure out on certain levels why this happens. That's very important. So rather than sitting back and saying, it doesn't matter, it's all random, you say, someone figured it out. Again, and this is so fundamental. Oftentimes they give analogies. It's like the fish doesn't know it's in water because the world is just kind of, the fish is always in water, and water seems to be like not, not relevant because it's like immersed in it. And you say the same, theoretically speaking, or not theoretically, absolutely speaking about God, is that we're living in a God world that we can't, it's so all around us, like we don't see the air, so to speak, but we're still living in it. So the interesting thing is, one of the fundamental things that we completely surround ourselves by all the time is the idea that there is cause and effect. And if you didn't have that concept for 1 second, that the world is not random, that the world is knowable, right? You would not do anything. You wouldn't go to work because randomly your checks might not come. You wouldn't go get up in the morning or eat because, there might be, instead of, eating through the mouth, you could be plugging yourself into a wall and getting, sustenance that way. It's like that never happens, practically speaking. We live a life of cause and effect, and that pervades absolutely everything we do. again, there's nothing that we don't do. It's like, why do I sit in this side of the car, not the other side of the car? Why do I press the gas? Because the gas is always giving me the left side. It didn't switch randomly at night, right? Because the world doesn't work that way. So all of our understanding of the world, all of science, all of medicine, all of everything follows a fixed structure that is knowable, and by understanding it, then I can determine why certain things happen based on their relevance to me, by the way. So if a person has a situation where something in their life happens, instead of jumping to a conclusion which makes absolutely no sense for the rest of their life, for anything else in their life, and it's an unreasonable, unusual, unknowable standard, right? You say, well, that was just completely random. It's like, no, it wasn't, right? Why did it happen? Well, it happened for a reason. And if I turn that off, if I say to myself, I don't think that happened for a reason, or that was just completely random, I've just walked myself into a different way of understanding this event from everything else in my life. I'm still going to make my coffee the same way. I'm not going to say maybe it's random, maybe this didn't happen for a reason. It's like if I come in and the coffee's spilled all over the counter, and I'm just going to say, like, I'm not going to look for like how the coffee maker broke. I'm not going to look for that. I'm just going to try to do it again like that. That makes no sense. So a person has to appreciate, first and foremost, that in a Jewish world, which is not just a Jewish world, but a normal world, everything is happening for a reason, because it functions according to the paradigm of of cause and effect. And so if a person doesn't understand why that happens, rather, again, if it matters to them, which let's be totally candid, why people might take the approach, it doesn't matter. So again, pain happens, something bad happens to us, and it's possible you could look at that and say not paying attention, and we'll get to that, why people might say that. But if it hurts and you don't want it to perpetuate, or something bad happened and you don't want it to happen again, instead of saying it was random, the practical, realistic, actual approach that a person should take is, well, this happened for a reason. How do I know? Because everything in my life happens for a reason. And we're not talking about some kind of like fatalistic, I have to be a big religious fundamentalist to believe this kind of thing. Not at all. It's like, I do everything in my life because I believe, I appreciate, I understand that there is a practical functionality to the world, and things will happen the way that they do. And if I want something to happen for bad or for worse, they will happen depending on what I'm expecting. The most important thing, if you'll forgive me, 1 second. Yeah, sure. Why this happens, going back, if we could. So now a person has to appreciate, first of all, why things happen, right? And the first thing you have to ask is, did this happen for a reason, right? And if it happened for a reason, right, which we know everything in the world happens for a reason, you have to start by asking, what was the reason that this happened? Now, again, in a Jewish world, nothing, and again, that's ultimately, if we think about it, one of the most painful things in the world to ever think about is that maybe we're suffering alone. Maybe this happened for no reason. Maybe the pain doesn't fit into some kind of cosmic, universal, theme. And that's a painful thought. Why? Because it makes it seem like everything that happens to us didn't have a purpose and was extremely just random. And the reason why that is difficult, again, I talk about this a lot when it comes to personal development, right? Is that we do things or things happen in our life that we don't like, right? And that's one thing. That's a practical thing, and that's very real. On top of it, we oftentimes judge ourselves for the things that we think happened. So now not only did you do something that you're not happy with, now you're judging yourself on top of the things that you're unhappy with. So now you have two problems, right? And then oftentimes we'll go even further than that. Then you start talking to people and they start judging you. So you basically build this entire structure of negativity that you slowly have to take away piece by piece by piece. Again, we speak about that a lot in the world of coaching, in the world of development, right? That a person has to stop shoulding themselves, right? I should be in a different place. This, that, the other thing, because it causes all kinds of frustration. And the reality is not just that it causes frustration, it makes your problem more complex. Why? Because now instead of just changing your behavior, you now have to work through all of the negative self-esteem that you've generated based on you should be in a different place, and go back and start to think to yourself, oh, well, I have to change that and I have to fix my self-esteem and this, and eventually, like, maybe never, but possibly you'll come to a place where you can just practically say, okay, now I'm ready just to change the action, or now I'm ready to try to do something different next time, right? So there's this fundamental crazy concept when things happen, when you are affected by negativity and you feel alone, right? So you're in pain and now you start to feel alone. So now there's two things, because there's the pain, and then there's the sense, the frustration, the deep despair that it all happened not for a reason, or that you're just kind of alone in your suffering. Now, interestingly enough, the second two pieces never have to fall on you if you are looking at the world through a Jewish worldview. If you believe, again, and it's so funny because so many of us, like, we have our Jewish cards, like we live Jewishly, right? You might keep the Sabbath, or you might keep kosher, or you might belong to just like the Jewish club, and you're like, okay, I'm part of the club, right? But what does it actually mean? Well, here's a huge thing that it means. If you're part of the Jewish club, if you subscribe to the Jewish mindset, if you're part of the Jewish people, one of the things is you have to appreciate that your suffering is never random and that you're never alone. What does that mean, practically speaking? If you buy into this Jewish concept of God, if they buy into the Jewish concept of the randomness of the big meaning, people, again, everyone says, oh, I believe in the universe and in the first cause. That's all you need, man. All you need, as soon as that happens, you can realize by logically deducing that you're not alone. For sure, you're not alone, right? And B, that the things that happen to you are not random. And then, again, that leads us to a third piece, which is incredibly difficult, which is then this happened. There's some reason why this happened. Now, if a person goes from that perspective, right, you stub your toe. And again, when you stub your toe, you're like, okay, maybe something. But like when really horrible things happen, it becomes very difficult for us to appreciate and to realize that things happen for a reason. And again, that's one of, and I don't know if this is such a big concern nowadays anymore, but for quite a while, people were really upset about this. I think nowadays it's kind of in a lot of ways, an excuse, right? But people say, well, how could God allow the Holocaust? That question indicates exactly what we're saying, which is, if you buy into a God, right, and God is in control, then there are horrible things that happen. And if God is in control, then you start to ask yourself, well, like, where was that? Or what did that mean? And when you start to experience that question, all of a sudden you get immediately, if you're being intellectually honest, overwhelmed, because you're like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. Why is it, again, and there's two methodologies of appreciating why that's terrible. Point number one is terrible is, well, what does that mean? Like, just because, again, we want very much in a lot of ways our lower selves, our childish selves want and desire a world where everything is perfect and nothing bad happens. And, it's like if I'm a good little boy or a good little girl, or if I just believe in God, or say, again, I was going to say it's 3 Hail Marys, but that, like the whatever the Jewish equivalent is, give tzedakah, right? So then, like, nothing bad ever happens. And it's like, that's not true. Because if you look at the world, right, the world functions. And a lot of times you'll have very seemingly, quote, again, good people, like we say, good people. This was a question Moses asked. It's a good question. Moses says, why do the righteous suffer? Why do the wicked prosper? And the world that we perceive is a very complex world. And we're putting a binary system on the world where God knows about everything, is in control of everything. How do you perceive those kinds of things? Now, what you don't do is say, well, it must not be binary, must not be complex. If I don't understand it, it could be that it doesn't exist, or it could be that it's not relevant. That, again, we said that doesn't make sense. It's like, the country's going in a recession, and you think to yourself, well, that was completely random, I guess. It must be that no one's in control. And it's like, no, right? Why is that impractical? Why is that problematic? Because the recession will affect you, no matter what. Right? The way of the world will affect you, whether or not you want to think, right, that it doesn't matter to you. That's why we have this concept in Jewish philosophy that God will speak to you, right? We talk about this Rosh Hashanah time, right? That God wants a message to come across. And he'll start by attacking, discussing the thing that's the furthest from you, right? He'll start with maybe your money, right? Depending on how you're wired, ideally, right? And then he'll go to the things that are close to you. Then he'll go to your body itself, right? So there's an idea that God wants things from you, and the fastest way to screw yourself up more is to try to justify or suggest that those things don't really matter, or I'm not really paying attention. It's like, no, don't do that, right? If you perceive that there's a recession coming and you think to yourself, well, it's all random, I guess maybe this won't affect me. It's like, no, it will. And you think to yourself, well, why did it happen? Why should you ask why it happened? Because that might give you more information about how long it'll last, or what the appropriate way to go is, or what opportunities are becoming available, or where are your investments most at risk, right? So if you ask these questions, you're able to actually live in a practical world, as opposed to sort of hoping it doesn't affect you, which in most cases it will affect you, or attempting to assign a level of randomness, at which point I can't do anything. So now, I alluded to this, but we're going to come back to it now, practically speaking. Why do most people not want to say these kinds of things? Why do most people not want to engage on a practical level with the reality that suffering is not random, that challenges are not just happenstance, and that, kind of these things are happening for a reason? In most cases, it's because it's not that they don't want to admit that like bad things can happen and they have to reevaluate or re-understand their relationship with God, which is something interesting and not really the focus of what we're discussing today. But for most people, the reason why you don't want to look at what's going on is because there's a chance that you did it yourself and you're going to have to change something. Now that's very difficult, because if you're dealing, again, going back to these massive world tragedies. Again, you buy a house you can't afford, and now you're kind of in the red. That's one kind of tragedy. You look at yourself and you say, oh man, like, well, I don't have any money. It's like, well, look at your spending habits and maybe you can figure that out. And you're like, well, I don't want to do that because then I'm going to have to change my spending habits, right? But you look at something much bigger. You look at a Holocaust. You look at the Communist Revolution. You look at a World War I. You look at a Great Depression. You look at these massive situations in life. And it becomes so overwhelming, the personal cost and the implications of the personal cost and how I would have stood up in those environments, all those kind of things. You're like, it's too big for me. And it's like, no, it's not. Because ultimately there's an idea that, again, in a perfect world, in an ideal world, in the world that we live in, not a perfect world, the world that we live in, the practical world, right? A world of complete control. So like God put us in a world where those things happened. Maybe they happened in our lifetime. Maybe they didn't. Maybe we look at that later as students of history. And then we have to ask very complex, difficult questions. The question you don't want to ask is, right? Suggest is, no big deal, right? No big deal. I'm gonna live the way that I want, because there are certain things that happen, we hope, that wake you up to appreciate that there are bigger things at stake, right? And the lessons that you can derive from there will impact the world that you have right now, because that's ultimately the idea. We live in a world of our perception, of our appreciation, of the way that we see the world, right? So that's ultimately, at the end of the day, what matters is how we see the world, because, well, that's the only reality that we live in, right? You can see, that's why it says in a famous Jewish book, it speaks about a person has to find their role in their world, olamo, in his world, in the person's world. What does that mean? It means that ultimately we all live in a world of complete subjectivity, which is fascinating, right? So it's like something horrible happened in the world outside of my purview, right? But then you think to yourself, but I'm here and I have my perspective. So it's like, there was a Holocaust and then I'm here. And you think to yourself, well, I don't know, it's too massive, I can't consider it. But that's not the way to look at it, because the way that we look at everything in our life should be necessarily, how does it affect me? What's the implications of this? What can I know about? And again, could be that there's nothing, but maybe start by looking at it, right? So you think to yourself, again, one beautiful lesson that actually was impacted by one of the stories from Aish HaTorah's founder, Rav Noach Weinberg, is he went to the concentration camps, and he famously quoted, I believe he was quoting Rav Shach, or maybe he was just saying to himself, if you look at one man's capacity to kill 6 million people, right, you can appreciate one man's capacity to save 6 million people. And that pushes him to see an importance, a relevance of going out and doing good in the world. And could be that there is a million, a billion, an infinite number of messages that came from the tragedy of the Holocaust, but practically speaking, for your life, that could be what you need to walk away with it, right? Because practically speaking, it'll affect you. You look at the world more, right? The same thing. It's like if you start to look at the depths of the depravity, the horrible things that happen in the world, but you walk away with a lesson of the enduring human spirit. Or you look at Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and you say, well, but the real lesson of Auschwitz was that people are able to control their response to things. You have no control over anything in your life except how you respond to things. And it's like, that's a really deep lesson. That's a profound lesson. It's a very practical lesson, because, God willing, you won't live through a Holocaust anymore. That happened one time, but you will certainly live through things where in your life you will be destined, you will desire, you will want to strike back, you want to hit back, you want to go into deep depression, and then you think about that lesson that this one person came out of the Holocaust with, which is that you can control how you respond to everything. So that is a fundamental practical way to apply to your life. The reason why most people don't want to look at their life, they want to just say, well, it's all random, or, who cares, or we'll never know, is because when you look at things and you ask the deep questions, oftentimes it starts a process where you have to change and where you have to become better and different. And you can't just walk away and pretend like that never happened. So that's the challenge ultimately for all of us. So again, going back again, why this is so important is that if you ask a person, an average person on the street, you're Jewish. Everyone says, I'm proud to be Jewish. It's like, okay, great. What does that mean, practically speaking? And a lot of people are like, well, I like gefilte fish. You're like, okay, that's maybe me too. But like, is that it? That's what's so important to you? So, but this is very important. So a person says they're Jewish, this is the legacy that we're talking about. Step number one is that your suffering is not random and that you're not alone in the world. And that actually, if you think about it, God, and this is a very basic principle I didn't even develop today, but there's a concept, Olam Chesed Yibane, that God created the world with kindness. So there's an idea, again, that everything happens for a reason, and the reason's a good reason. Now, we appreciate, again, going back to the second point, we're humans, we're fallible, we don't know everything, right? But as a result of that, we can't just take this claim that it's unknowable or it's all totally random. It's like, no, if this matters, and again, we said that evil matters, difficult matters, struggle matters in my life, because that stuff seems very real, right? Since that matters, what happens? I have to be able to look at that, to ask objective questions, to think about what are the implications for my life. And if you're able to do that, if you're able to think through that, oftentimes what will come out through deep analysis is something practical in your life that you can do. And so that's very important. And it's for sure not going to be the whole story, right? Because nothing happens in a vacuum. Let's say you have someone, again, one of the big challenges, and this is a huge thing, it's like with suicide, is that, suicide doesn't just affect the person that leaves the world, right? That takes their own life. It's like they have a family, they have a legacy, they might have children, they might have a spouse, they might have people that rely on them. And that's ultimately, again, when you live in a very dark place and when you think that there's no way out, and oftentimes you think to yourself, like, maybe if I would just, either actively take my life or fall on a sword or whatever it might be, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. The way, again, this is a very deep, very hard, very, like, not doing the subject justice, but one of the things that take you out of the abyss is to appreciate, well, what about my kids? What about my wife? What about the things that people that need me? And once you start to see that, all of a sudden your life takes on a whole different meaning. You're like, well, for me it doesn't matter, but I will maybe preserve for my children, or I'll preserve for my spouse, or I'll preserve for my organization, my institution, or maybe my religion, or maybe my God, right? By getting out of your own head and your own miserableness, and you're looking at the things that are outside of yourself, and you're thinking, wow, there's a bigger picture here, and I have to show up for other people. So if you have that mentality, right, it's going to affect how you go through your life. And oftentimes it's going to push you into a proactive mood. And when you're proactive and not reactive, when you're proactive and not kind of sitting back and thinking it's all completely irrelevant or it's all too difficult, all of a sudden you're going to start making changes in your life that actually matter. And if you're doing those kinds of things, you'll find meaning in everything. You'll find meaning in the darkest things, right? Again, it's like, maybe if you think about it, like the people that lost everybody, they became, one thing is they came away with we have to preserve maybe our culture. We have to preserve the memories of people that went away. We have an obligation to kind of, again, all of these things. I don't know if that's the right thing for everybody, certainly not for everybody, but for those people, it gave them a tremendous sense of meaning. So that's the whole point. A person in their own world has to find that relevant piece or pieces from tragedy by developing these tools that we spoke about and go forward with that. Because if you can't do that, right, ultimately it doesn't mean that the event had no purpose. It ultimately means that you have no purpose because you are supposed to be reacting to your world and being proactive. I'll end famously. I'm not going to famously end, but I'm going to end with the famous quote from the Megillah where Mordechai goes to Esther, and Esther was, she was in this position of power where she was the queen to Achashverosh, and Mordechai said, you have to go and talk to the king and try to save the Jews, and if you don't, right, we'll find salvation some other way, but you and your father's house is going to be lost because maybe this is the reason that you were here in the first place. And so that's the most profound Jewish concept in the world, which is it's like you have to look at your world and you have to appreciate, I don't know why necessarily this is happening in the big scheme of things, but there's certainly got to be an obligation for me. I certainly have to find in my own life where I can step up, I can make the world a better place. And if you focus on that, as opposed to the inherent tragic nature, so to speak, of the world from the human perspective that we see, you live a life life of meaning. You live a life of control. You live a life where you realize that you can have an effect on the world. And as a result of that, you live a very powerful, proactive life. Thank you.